What you eat in the 48 hours before endurance or sports events could make or break your performance. Today I'm going to break down everything you need to know about carb loading, how to do it properly, avoid common mistakes, and fuel for peak output when it matters the most. Carb loading is a strategic method to saturate your muscles and liver with glycogen, the body's premium fuel during intense or prolonged activity. Normally, you can store around 500 grams in the muscles and 100 grams in the liver. With carb loading, the aim is to push those numbers up and beyond to boost performance. So let's first start with the benefits of effective carb loading. Now, when this is done right, carb loading can delay fatigue, boost energy levels, improve endurance, reduce your risk of hitting the wall, and athletes who carb load correctly can improve time to exhaustion by up to 20% in endurance events. Now looking at the top 5 mistakes people make. So here's what most people get wrong. Number 1, eating too much fiber, which can lead to bloating, and then obviously that's going to be disruptive to the GI tract and your stomach, and that's not ideal in long events like marathons, ultra marathons, if you're doing Ironman, high rocks, anything like that. Number 2, not eating enough carbs, which obviously leads to low performance, running out of energy, fatigue, early fatigue in the race. Number 3, going too high on fat, again, slows down digestion. We don't really want the GI tract and the stomach and the digestive system to be doing a lot of work if you're trying to perform for a long period of time. Number 4, trying new foods. Of course, that's evident why and logical why you wouldn't want to try new foods before a race. And only doing it the day before an event. That doesn't allow enough time to carb load and to saturate your muscles and liver in surplus amounts of glucose or glycogen. And one thing we need to be careful of, obviously, is not tapering training properly, and this can sabotage your efforts. So the ACSM, which is the American College of Sports Medicine. So I'm going to be referring to the ASM quite a lot in this this video, because they're the largest sports exercise science organization in the world, and they've done a lot of research into many areas of sports and exercise science, and obviously they've set frameworks and parameters for certain performance metrics like carb loading, things even like the lowest amount of exercise people should have, which is like 150 minutes per week. They've done all the research on this, right? So they're the leading authority in this space. And this is where myself as a coach will draw a lot of information from and data to help drive performance for my clients and myself. So anyway, the ACSM advises tapering your training during carb loading phase to allow full glycogen replenishment. Now, logically, obviously, if you're leading up to an event where you want to perform at a high level, you would want to taper your training anyway, because you don't want to be fatigued or overly fatigued going into that event. But obviously, tapering the training in relation to carb loading allows you to replenish and not be using up those stores prior to the performance event that you need to be at. Okay, looking at glycogen storage. So unless you're fasting or unless you've completed a long and exhausting exercise session, your muscles already contain varying amounts of glycogen. How much? Well, a well-nourished person that weighs about 80 kg on average stores about 500 grams of glycogen. Now, although you can boost this even more by eating a carbohydrate-rich diet, since each gram of glucose can be converted into 4 kilocalories of usable energy, this equates to 2,000 calories of stored energy. Of this, around 400 grams or 1,600 calories are in your muscles, and about 100 grams or 400 calories of glycogen are stored in your liver. So that is a lot of energy you can store within your body. Yeah, and obviously you can push these numbers up through adaptation to carb loading, right? And obviously if you're heavier, then these numbers would be higher. So muscles store their own fuel in the form of glycogen, and the liver provides an additional source of glycogen that can be converted into glucose. In fact, your body can store a fair amount of glycogen, enough to fuel a 20 to 30 mile run at a moderate intensity, but there is a limit to how much glycogen you can store. Glycogen holds onto water, and water has weight. So If you could store an unlimited amount of glycogen, you would eventually weigh too much to get around, and it would be deleterious to your performance effort. Once glycogen stores are maximized, extra macronutrients, mainly carbohydrates and fat, are stored as fat, and you have almost an unlimited ability to store fat. That's why a lot of people suffer with obviously being overweight, obesity, stuff like that. So looking at the role of role of diet in glycogen storage, how much glycogen is in your muscles and liver at any one time is closely related to your diet and how much stored glycogen you burn off through exercise. If you eat a high carbohydrate diet and consume enough calories, you maximize your glycogen stores. Yet fasting for as little as a day can greatly reduce your muscle and liver stores of glycogen. When this happens, your body is dependent on fat as a fuel source, as well as ketone bodies produced by the rapid breakdown of fat. On the other hand, eating a very high carbohydrate diet for a few days will almost double your body's baseline glycogen stores to the point that they reach maximum capacity. Studies show most people can store a maximum of 15 grams of glycogen per kilogram of body mass. So an 80 kilogram person can hoard a maximum of around 1,200 kilograms of glycogen under optimal conditions. That's not insignificant, since 1,200 grams of glycogen is equivalent to 4,800 calories of energy, a large amount of energy. And obviously that's an 80 kilogram person. If you weigh less, it's going to be a little bit, obviously the numbers are going to be different, but obviously if you're a bit heavier, then of course it's going to be more. Exercise, of course, depletes glycogen stores, and how quickly you deplete it depends on the intensity of your workouts. As mentioned, you might be able to run a distance of 30 miles at a moderate intensity before you empty your glycogen stores. But if you do a very high intensity workout, you could drain your muscle glycogen stores in as little as an hour. Of course, this depends on how full your glycogen stores are when they started. Okay, so let's get into the more specifics of how much carbs you should be loading depending on the length of your event. So for events lasting longer than 90 minutes, the ACSM recommends carbohydrate loading with 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass per day for 36 to 48 hours before the event. While for shorter high-intensity sports, 6 to 8 grams per kilogram of body mass per day for 24 hours prior is suggested. So longer events greater than 90 minutes, we're looking at a range of 8 to 12 grams per kilogram. I suggest you, if you're not really used to carb loading, or if you're on the lighter side of a person, like 50, 60 kg, something like that, use the lower end of this scale and then see how you fare with that. And obviously, as you adapt, even if you're like 80, 90 kg, even way more, start at the lighter end, and then over time, as you practice carb loading in your training, you can push these numbers up and be able to consume more carbs and store more carbs without necessarily putting on weight. Looking at the timing, implement this high carbohydrate diet for 36 to 48 hours before the event. And the rationale here and strategy is to maximize muscle glycogen stores, providing a significant energy reserve for prolonged exercise. So for shorter events, as we've mentioned, consume 6 to 8 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass. Timing, implement this strategy for 48 hours before, 24 hours before the event. And the rationale here, this approach helps to ensure adequate carbohydrate availability for the high intensity demands of these sports. So that could be things like high rocks, football, soccer, any field sport. You can even carb load for like weightlifting comps and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to just look into a little bit more of the direct research from ACSM and see what they say in the literature. So just generally looking at carbohydrates, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that moderate exercise, so 1 hour per day, requires about 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of carbohydrates, while moderate to high intensity exercise, so 1 to 3 hours, mandates 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. Ultra endurance athletes with extreme levels of commitment to daily activity, 4 to 5 hours of moderate to high intensity exercises, may need up to 8 to 12 grams per kg per day. And of course, the International Society of Sports Nutrition recommends, in order to maximize glycogen stored, athletes should employ the 8 to 12 gram per kg range. Carbohydrate, as blood glucose and muscle glycogen, has the advantage of generating more ATP per volume of oxygen compared to fat, but exhaustion of liver and muscle carbohydrate stores is associated with fatigue, reduced work, impaired concentration. It is often described the feeling by athletes of hitting the wall or bonking. I recently learned that word, bonking. Therefore, fueling strategies both before and during the race event have been developed and outlined below. An important point to the clinician, however, is that even after 4.5 hours of cycling at 70% maximum oxygen consumption, when carbohydrate stores should be entirely depleted, elite athletes can still run at 16 kilometers per hour for an additional 2.5 hours at 66% of the VO2 max. Yeah. Consequently, glycogen depletion must not be the sole determinant of fatigue. Other carbohydrate sources such as lactate utilization and other mechanisms such as increased capability to oxidize fat will play a role. I'll probably talk on this a little bit because it starts to delve into how like you can become fat adapted, and I often encourage people to train in terms of carbohydrate dosage for training, train low, so your body gets used to tapping into other stores of energy, so lactate, being fat adapted, being able to oxidize energy from other areas without having to just solely rely on this high carbohydrate intake. And that sets you up better for when you do carb load, you're kind of super compensating how much carbs you're used to having. You'll get this additional boost in performance, but you're fat adapted. So when those sources run out or those stores run out, you're able to oxidize energy from fat or from other sources like lactic acid, etc., etc. So pre-competition loading. So prior to the race, if events last less than 90 minutes, a simple topping off of glycogen stores to replenish muscle and liver glycogen lost during the prior day has been recommended, typically with a carbohydrate-rich diet, so of at least 6 grams per day per kg, and up to 7 to 12 per kg in the 24-hour period before the event. For events lasting greater than 90 minutes, however, glycogen supercompensation or carbo loading in the preceding 36 to 48 hours may help improve performance by 2 to 3%. Traditionally, it's been recommended that in order to double glycogen stores in the classical supercompensation model, one had to exhaust glycogen stores with high-intensity exercise prior to high carbohydrate intake. However, recent studies show that short-term high-intensity exercise or even complete physical inactivity followed by a one-day high 10 to 12 grams intake of carbohydrates similarly achieves glycogen supercompensation, and this is maintained for 3 days. This latter point is particularly important to consider clinically as it gives the athlete additional flexibility in athletes with gastrointestinal intolerability or GI distress prior to competition. So that's a point to consider because sometimes it can be difficult to consume a lot of carbohydrates and being able to tolerate it in your gut. So one, you can either go about the process of trying to start in on the lower end and working to train low and keep your carbs at the low end of the scale, and maybe in time push it up and get used to being able to tolerate it instead of trying to just dump loads of carbs in 3 days before an event and then you get GI tract upset. So in the final 1 to 4 hours prior to the event, a single dose of 1 to 4 grams per kg of carbs is recommended for a final top-up of liver glycogen stores, as typically endurance events occur early in the morning, directly after the overnight fast of sleeping, which depletes liver glycogen. So looking at during competition fueling, so for events lasting less than 60 minutes, no exogenous carbohydrate ingestion is required. However, for activities greater than 60 minutes, active fueling strategies are recommended to maintain carbohydrate accessibility. For events lasting 1 to 2.5 hours, 30 to 60 grams per hour is commonly recommended in a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution. So that's concentrations typically found in sports drinks. So you're looking at hypertonic or isotonic drinks, which will be super hydrating. Yeah. So ideally consumed every 10 to 15 minutes to maximally spare glycogen stores. For events lasting greater than 2.5 hours, higher carbohydrate intakes of 60 to 70 grams per hour and up to 90 grams per hour, if tolerable, are associated with improved performance. This higher intake recommendation stems from research demonstrating that exogenous carbohydrate oxidation peaks at a carbohydrate ingestion rate of 1.0 to 1.1 gram per minute due to the maximal GI absorption at this rate, including multiple carbohydrate sources, glucose, fructose mixtures at higher ingestion rates of 1.8 grams per minute can further increase oxidation up to 1.2 to 1.3 grams per minute due to differential intestinal transport mechanisms. And these glucose-fructose combinations also improve GI tolerance. At these higher ends of intake, authors recommend athletes routinely practice their fueling plan to assess GI comfort. For example, liquid carbohydrate may be more tolerable than solids. And obviously practicability of your fueling plan as well. Fueling chances may vary according to the rules of the sport. For example, half times during games, you have minimal opportunity, or especially like swim events, triathlons, versus ideal opportunity during bike, etc. And these should be rehearsed generally. We also recommend athletes should practice their fueling plan at race game intensity, as GI tolerability can be decreased on race day due to increased stress response and sympathetic-parasympathetic imbalance on game day. Another important clinical consideration is in hot conditions. Clinicians should counsel athletes to reduce carbohydrate intake by 10% due to lowered carbohydrate oxidation rates in hot environments. So in other words, train low may help improve athletes in these low gears, maximizing fat oxidation for prolonged exercise at lower intensities, but at the expense of losing the athlete's high gear, so which is maximal glucose oxidation, and that's often needed during race situations. So this is something, as I've noted here, this is often a strategy I employ with clients to train low, to essentially become fat adapted. This improves fat oxidation capabilities when carbs are low and can increase performance when carbs are increased. In addition, train low may adversely affect other types of training, such as altitude training and consequently adaptation. Furthermore, many of the train low studies are in laboratory settings and not in real world race situations. Right, so obviously there is some evidence here saying that it does obviously mitigate, or it will hinder performance. But in my experience, because you start to become more fat adapted, it doesn't necessarily hinder performance in the long run. But that is my real world experience of the strategy. Obviously in a lab, they're showing otherwise, but it's something to experiment with yourself generally. And you can taper that across the week as well, training low in certain days, but also increasing or carb loading for maybe a longer run on the weekend, right? So there's many ways to train your body to adapt to different situations. An interesting study by Cox et al. Showed that while train low induced changes in mitochondrial enzyme activity, there was no performance difference in actual exercise situations with either trained cyclists or triathletes involved in steady state exercise and time trial cycling. Therefore, many suggest it could be a tool in the tool belt, something obviously I try to utilize and what I've talked about as a part of an athlete's overall training and nutrition plan, but should not be employed in high intensity training or race situations due to performance concerns. All right, so what to eat? Carb loading isn't about junk food. It's not an opportunity to just guzzle down a load of donuts and whatnot. Quality matters. Prioritize simple, fast digesting carbs like white rice, bread, noodles, oats. Liquid carbs, smoothies, fruit juice, flavored milk. Small, frequent meals and snacks. Swap protein bars and yogurt for cereal bars, rice bowls, honey, and jam. Because generally, yogurt can be intolerable to the GI tract in intense events, and protein bars are also quite intolerable to the gut. And what to avoid? Here's what to limit during your carb load. Limit high fiber foods, so things like brown rice, lentils, beans, raw vegetables. High fat foods, fried meals, pastries, large cheese portions, all can be very disruptive to the GI tract and digestion. And of course, spicy and carbonated drinks, they can also disrupt digestion. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that and got some valuable information. If you want help to optimize your health and performance, shoot me a message. We can book in a call, have a chat about what you may need help with. And hope you have a good one. See you on the next one.